Hello, 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 everyone. We are back with Tales issue number 4. If you don't know what this series is, this is a series covering the Dark Horse Comics run Star Wars Tales, which was a series that told lots of different stories in each issue in each of their issues across multiple different eras. But the thing was that some of these stories weren't canon. That's right, some of these were non-canon infinities. But some of them were C-canon and were part of the expanded universe. If you haven't seen my other videos about this already, I'd recommend you go check them out. I've already covered issues 1 to 3, and I plan on doing a separate video for each and every issue of Star Wars Tales, where I break down each story within each one and tell you, based on Leland Chee's information, what story was EU canon in Tales and which stories in Tales were non-canon infinities. Let's get right into it. This is Tales issue number 4 that we've got this time. I love the cover, which is actually depicting one of the EU stories on the cover. But let's get into what Leland Chee's rules were. Now, I discuss this in every video, but again, I'll do a quick recap. Stories that had elements from them referenced in EU sources that came out afterwards were considered to be canon. So, for example, if one of the short comics in Tales introduces a character, a planet, an element, and it was referenced later in an EU source book or in another EU story, that was considered to be EU canon and part of the EU, as the later source referencing it further cemented it as being in the top tier. Stories that were outrageous or comedic were considered non-canon. So stories from several writers like Kevin Rubio, who wrote the Tag and Bink non-canon comics, wrote these comedic, outrageous stories that on purpose were supposed to get your jaw to drop open as you're surprised at some of the crazy slapstick humor that unfolds within the universe. Some of these are just considered to be literally just ridiculous, off the walls crazy. According to Leland Chee, those ones were considered to not be canon. However, some of those stories were referenced in later EU media. So then we have this gray area. And so for the purpose of this series, I make the final judgment call there. And then there's a gray area where some of the stories aren't comedic, but aren't referenced elsewhere. This is a further gray area. And here I will be making the determination once again. So, with Leland Chee's policies for Star Wars Tales out of the way, let's dive right in and talk about the first of 4 stories in the Star Wars Tales volume. Most volumes of Star Wars Tales have 4 stories within them. The first story is called Moment of Doubt, and it was referenced elsewhere in the EU, which are points in its favor. The Imperial officer of Ch'Arb was referenced later in the Star Wars Complete Encyclopedia, and the character of Staz Kaziak, who's this assassin, this imposter, he is referenced elsewhere in the EU, also in the Complete Star Wars Encyclopedia. So therefore, this is points in its favor. These characters introduced in this story are mentioned again, which is a good sign for it. This story also references the EU by mentioning in the story Talon Karad, Talon Karde, and the planet Merkur. So it references a character and a planet from the Thrawn trilogy. So since it references the EU, it makes more sense that it's within continuity. It is not intended to be comedic or outrageous. This is a pretty grisly story. It's a revenge story, as Staz Kaziak is trying to get revenge on Vader for a variety of reasons. I won't try to get too heavily into spoilers, but I guess this is about to be a major spoiler. There's a grisly decapitation at the end of the story, and it looks absolutely gnarly. The art on these panels is really good. The art is very serious, and this is definitely not supposed to be comedic in nature. It's quite a fun story for Tales, in my opinion. So, since it's not intended to be comedic or outrageous, it references already established EU, and it was referenced, and the story itself was referenced later in the expanded universe by other material. My opinion is this is certified EU canon. Moving on to story number 2. A Death Star is born, which is a play on the A Star is Born title that has been used on various media throughout the various years of history, back to the 1930s, I believe. This story is not referenced elsewhere in the EU. Nothing from the events of this story was ever referenced again. However, it does reference the EU. The characters of Tol Sivron and Bevel Lemesque being from Darksaber, and Tol Sivron being from, I can't remember quite where. I think the Adventure Journals. Both characters who were featured in the Death Star novel, as they were involved in the Death Star's creation. Those characters do appear here. So then it's like, oh my goodness, these EU characters are featured prominently here. But it's very clearly intended to be comedic and outrageous. For example, Yogi Bear appears in this. Big Boy appears in this comic. There's comedic moments where it implies that Vader leaked the Death Star plans to the rebels. And then there's Mickey Mouse ears showing up throughout the various panels. There's coffee, and then they mention that they have Aqualish water from the water world of Aquala, or where the Aqualish species are from, and it's implied that they make them slave to drink the fresh water. It's intended to be comedic and outrageous. It's ridiculous. It's stupid. It's like this meeting where Tarkin's trying to get funding for the Death Star. And it's just like, what is this story? What is this story, you know? So my opinion, even though it features EU characters from Darksaber and the Adventure Journals, it's never referenced again. And it's it's supposed to be funny. It's very outrageous. So my opinion, definitely non-canon, which is not bad for it to not be in continuity, because this story is really bad. Really bad. Tales is known to be controversial and hit and miss. Next, we have the story Spare Parts. This story tells a story of C-3PO and R2-D2 being abducted by Jawas. Is this a separate time than when they're abducted by Jawas in A New Hope? Is this supposed to be the same time or a separate occasion? It's not made clear in the story. It's just really weird. How often are these droids getting kidnapped by Jawas? It's insane. And in this story, they then dress as Jawas to attempt to escape the sand crawler. And as they're getting away, the Jawas recognize them because they're tall and don't look like Jawas even when wearing Jawa cloaks. So then they run after them with ion blasters and take them back. This story is not referenced elsewhere in the EU. It is clearly intended to be comedic, even though it's not funny at all. I wasn't laughing. It's definitely considered to be outrageous. And does it even fit in the canon? I don't know that it does. It's just such a weird, dumb story. So my opinion, based on that it's not referenced again in the EU, and that it's very clearly intended to be comedic and outrageous. Therefore, according to Leland Chee's policies, this story, Spare Parts, is non-canon, in my opinion. Next, we have a pretty good one. Big Giz and Spiker in Sand Blasted. This one's referenced elsewhere in the EU. It had original characters named Bok, Iggy, and Nonam. All of these characters had entries in the complete Star Wars encyclopedia. So therefore, since it's referenced elsewhere in the EU, that's a good sign for this story. It also references the EU. There is a ton of characters from the expanded universe in this story. Characters from the expanded universe in this story include Gizman, aka Big Giz, from the Shadows of the Empire multimedia project, Spiker from the Shadows of the Empire multimedia project, Rom Mock from the Dark Forces video game, Ono from the Jabba tape, and Dark Troopers from the Dark Forces video game. Speaking of the Jabba tape, which was a comic issue, this is essentially a sequel story to the Jabba tape, continuing elements from that comic and continuing and furthering the story. It's essentially a part 2 to that issue. So I really like this one. It is not intended to be comedic and outrageous in the sense that it's like, wacky and shock value, but it is funny. It's Big Giz. It's Spiker. It's Ono. These characters are wacky and funny and hilarious. So while it is comedic and it made me laugh, it's not intended to be comedic and outrageous in a way where the story should be discounted and disregarded. It's clearly bound by, common sense, which a lot of these other Tales stories lack, which shows that it is supposed to be in universe. So my opinion, based on all these factors, it's certified EU canon and a pretty good story to boot. Now, what do you guys think of Tales issue number 4? Let me know. I've been going through all of these, and it's been a little tricky because I don't really enjoy talking about the Tales comics. But I figured that these videos would be helpful. Hopefully they continue to be helpful and somewhat entertaining. As I feel like a lot of people just either say, oh, Tales, that's non-canon, and disregard all of it, when there's some good stuff that is in canon. And then some people accept it all and then point at Skippy the Jedi droid like, hey, that's so stupid, the EU bad. When no, based on Leland Chee's parameters and guidelines, that is non-canon. So I think it's very important to see that it's not all just a gray area. There's a clear line between canon and non-canon. So I thought it would be good to go through and outline every individual story and where it falls. Because I really hadn't seen that done anywhere. So I'm having some fun, if I can say that with Tales, going through this comic series and talking about these stories. So overall, we had 2 canon stories and 2 non-canon stories within this issue of Star Wars Tales. I'll see you next time when we talk about Star Wars Tales number 5. Sorry this one took a while. It was like a month or so after the last one. It won't be that long till the next one. The next one's coming in only a couple weeks, so it won't be as long as a gap this time around. Thank you for your patience, and I'll see you when we talk about Star Wars Tales issue number 5. Oh boy. We'll be in for a treat then.